Hi, welcome to Ms. Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information is U.S. Notes 5.23, Ford's Presidency. It includes information that aligns with the final section on your unit study guide. Remember, you have control over this lecture, so use your study guide to help you figure out what's important and take notes. Pause if you need to, write down any questions you have, and re-watch as often as you need. Let's go ahead and get started. So President Ford was the last American president involved in the Vietnam War. We talked about that a little bit with the evacuation from the embassy. He continued Nixon's Vietnamization, and he was the one who pulled the last American troops and individuals out of Vietnam. Nixon had also begun talks with the Soviet Union to limit the arms race. These talks, which resulted in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, were designed to get both the U.S. and the Soviet Union to limit the production of nuclear weapons in particular. So they were limiting weapons. Ford continued the talks that Nixon had started and promoted Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviets. SALT I was signed in 1972 under Nixon, but SALT II was actually signed by Ford in 1975. Despite this positive action, most of Ford's presidency was actually fraught with problems, both in the U.S. and abroad. At home, Ford was tainted by the Nixon scandal. Not only had he been picked by Nixon as his vice president, making him the only president never elected president or vice president, little trivia, his first official act as president was to pardon Nixon. So a pardon is an official forgiveness of a crime, and it happens after someone has been found guilty. Nixon was never found guilty, so essentially this meant that Ford was admitting that Nixon was guilty. It did not help the cause there. So Ford's popularity was super low, and he really struggled to gain support for any of his actions. In the U.S., the country faced inflation, or a rise in the cost of goods. Americans were also battling this thing called stagflation, which is a term to describe a period when inflation is high, but job growth is stagnant, so not growing at all. To try to decrease the effects of these high prices, Ford used his veto power 55 times. This resulted in the savings of $9.2 billion, with a B, billion, dollars for the American people. However, it didn't win him any allies in Congress, so even though he was helping, still didn't make people happy. To make matters worse, OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, began to use oil as a political and economic weapon in the early 1970s. So OPEC members stopped shipping oil to countries that supported Israel against the Arab nations. The U.S. was allied with Israel, so the oil embargo impacted prices and supply in the U.S. Over a matter of months, oil prices rose over 200%. So you can see in the graph there from 1973 to 77 how much it changed. This led to an oil shortage in the U.S. and an energy crisis. Demand for oil was high, the supply was low, so costs rose astronomically. This would continue into the late 70s and even into our next president. In 1976, Ford decided to run for president against the Democratic challenger, Jimmy Carter. So Ford was still associated with Nixon in many Americans' minds. They were concerned he was corrupt, and they just couldn't trust him, which meant that because of all that, Ford lost the election and Carter became our next president and the topic of our next set of notes. So this is actually the end of 5.23. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.